Okay, a couple of practicalities. We got started last week. We had the same slide, so I'm just adding it here. There's 100 and more of you, so there's little practicalities, and we have this pairing every week. So here's the recipe for success if something happens. If you miss a lecture, your pair isn't contacted and so forth, so don't worry. And adding into that also this fact that, remember, we're here to help. This course is not about bureaucracy as such. This is about giving you an opportunity to learn. So if you have a problem, we'll probably figure it out, so you can rely on that. You might need to have a little bit patience because you are over 100 people, but I'm sure. Maybe you last week already saw that we had some minor problems with the emails and reaching some of you, but I think at the end of the day, we made it, and we should be able to now have everybody's correct emails. So, and last week we talked about the introduction, having different kind of lenses, how to deal with uncertainty, where does this need for different kind of leadership, change agency comes from. And today we're going to focus on organizational transformations, giving a little bit of context and scope. What does it mean when we talk about organizational transformation in this course? And there you can see the rest of the schedule. So it's lecture 2 out of those 6. But before we go this week's theme, let's a few words about the exercises you returned today. And what did we learn from it? And before going to the actual, what did you submit, and I had a glimpse and went over what you did do, a couple just friendly reminders. First, please return also the reflections, not just the drawings, because the reflections are actually the thing. Second, once you return the reflections, reflect on the tool. Not so much about the other person's context and work and all that. And because these are all facilitation tools, you're doing all of these exercises more or less about the other person. So add the other person's name. First name is perfectly fine. But just to make sure that when we look at the exercises, we know that you didn't do it for yourself, because you remember that was many times. Don't do it for yourself. You need to do it for the pair. And the last line on that slide is to remind you that, hey, this course is about learning tools to facilitate others. That's why we use tools, we reflect on those tools, and we do it for the others. So that's really the point.
Can I just add something about this reflection?
Yeah.
So it's about use of tools. So what kind of how the tool helped you to facilitate, and how it created new understanding for you, and how you experienced using that. So experiencing, not just analyzing the tool as such, but reflecting your experience using it.
Absolutely, and we'll get to that later on. So the tools kind of build on top of each other, especially about what Jari said about trying to understand your role in it and reflections. And as a good example, I took the liberty, Eetu and Jani, if you are there listening, great job. This is actually your slide. Just to give people an example, it doesn't have to be anything more, it can be simple like this. What did you learn as a pair? How are you apply the learnings? And this is just a great example, and I'm not going to go through their good answers there, but you can see the kind of things that just bullet points and having a separate slide or page or whatever, just going, what did you learn about the tool and how are you going to apply it later? Thanks, Eetu and Jani. So what did you actually answer? I picked up a couple of quotes that really, I think, you kind of, in your reflections, you found things that we were looking for. So first of all, one of you said that this kind of a tool actually helps others to understand what the bigger picture is. Remember, and I underlined the word others here. It is a tool for the other person to understand what's the bigger picture. The next one, when you have to visualize something, you need to have a more in-depth understanding of the subject. And remember, this was a pair exercise. So the key here is that you, as the person doing the visualization, really have to understand what the other person is telling you. You really have to yourself get the in-depth understanding. So this tool and this pair setup is actually pushing you to do and do certain things and have a dialogue that actually has a meaning. Third quote, during explanation, you already have to wear the other glasses in order to make sense to the other person. I think this was brilliant, whoever wrote it, was that when you're explaining your stuff to the other person, you actually have to already change your lenses. You already have to go through that. How would I explain stuff that is obvious to me to that other person? So just introducing this tool and this setup, what has happened is that it kind of shows you, and the reflection helps you understand, okay. So suddenly I'm looking at this from a different perspective, and that's really the little things that we nudged you towards. And the last quote really nicely also shows that just drawing these simple onions and diagrams, it's possible to find out kind of dependencies and even possible conflicts of interest. Just drawing them out and explaining them to other people. Then maybe you're kind of like, now that I said it aloud, I realize there is this dependency between these two parts. And that's the magic of it in a way. I also added one more from last year. I think this is kind of a good one. This is last year's answers. When somebody wrote that this refers to the classic example of a medieval stone layers, where one said that he's laying bricks, and the other's response to that was he's building a cathedral. So what are you actually doing? Yes.
Can I add something? I'd like to emphasize this magic which happens when you start explaining something that it's so evident for you or self-clear or implicit that you start explaining it, then you start realizing it. That's why it's the facilitation that somebody's asking, you have to explain, that then you start to realize new things about that yourself. So that's a very basic mechanism what happens here, and reveals some new way of structuring, new way of seeing, new way of understanding your own context. So that's very important.
Yes. Just having a glimpse at the chat as well. So kind of to summarize the lesson learned from exercise 1 is that the onion, the tool, is a simplification, of course. Mm. But once you're forced to simplify, it means that you need to leave something out. And for you to know what to leave out, you must have some kind of focus and a way to prioritize things. This is what I'll leave in, this is what I'll leave out. And to be able to focus and prioritize, you must know why you are doing whatever you're doing. So just using this tool, and if you really kind of go a little bit back when you did this exercise, for those of you who did it, it kind of pushes actually, the more you think about it, the more you do it, it pushes you to answer questions called, what's your agenda? Why are you doing this? What's the aim? What's the impact you're aiming for? Why are you using this tool? What is it helping you to reach? Why are you drawing the onion? Which are just questions that if you're facilitating some kind of change, helps you perhaps clarify what is the change that you're actually facilitating. But of course, we didn't ask you to answer those questions yet. But if you now that you got kind of familiar with the tool, got a kind of a taster what it tastes like, and the reflections you did, it was like, wow, okay, let's see what actually happened in this process. The more you think about it, the more actually the tool and the setup is pushing you towards those kind of questions. It's also a very useful tool because it's so simple to figure out two things. First, let's take an example that we use the tool for you. And then there's you're doing exercise number 1, that's the second layer. The exercise is part of this course. Maybe this course is part of your master's degree. Yeah, you can obviously draw this. But once you draw this and you look at it, you can see, well, that's not actually an organization now, is it? You're drawing some kind of other context, which is perfectly fine because now you realize that, that's not an organization. Then you could maybe do something like this as a participant of this course. There's you, there's you and your peer. Well, that's an organization already. Rest of the course participants, yeah, that's definitely an organization. Everybody at the course. Now that's an organization, yes, you just drew an organization with the layer onions. But is there really an agenda for change? No, not really. What I'm driving at is this. In other words, this tool works if you have an organization. And this is probably many of you students were like, oh, what should I do here? Well, I have this project, thesis project, and then you drew the organization. You kind of maybe were finding out, does it really fit my situation? Well, it doesn't matter in a sense, because now what happened was that using this tool shows you and helps you see if there is a clear organization here. What is the organization? And is there actually an agenda for change? And when you do this as a pair exercise, the other person listening and drawing this is actually probably thinking that, what are you explaining to me? Is this an organization you're explaining to me, or is this some other context? And is there any agenda for change? So what's the change in all of this that you're looking for? And these are kind of the next level sparring questions, facilitation questions, if you will, that you are kind of obvious with this tool. So remember, just a reminder, this tool in all its simplicity is very powerful when you need to figure out what is actually the organization here. And I think one of you in the exercises said that this tool nicely shows that the organization you're dealing with daily is different from the organization from the official organization maps. And the other thing that starts to clarify is the why. What's actually the change we are trying to do here? If you have a project, what is the change that the project is trying to achieve? It starts helping you understand that. And who are the stakeholders, and from whose perspective the change is what, and so forth and so forth. And we return to this in this week's exercise later today. And then last, final note. I don't know if any of you thought like this, but I felt like adding it. That you might feel that this was actually a stupid exercise. This was silly. Just draw some circles and that's it, and then you submit it and there you go. Well, this becomes very easily a silly exercise if you rely that this tool is the magic. That once you draw these circles, you kind of get a result. But like we hinted last week, that's not the thing. And what Jari already emphasized a few seconds ago, the magic is in the listening. So this tool is there to put the setup. The magic happens when you start listening to the other person, trying to understand what they are saying, why they are saying, and how could you help reach their goals. In other words, facilitation. Anything else? Jari, you want to add anything? I'm checking the chat as we speak.
Yeah, I'm fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Serendipity mindset. Yeah, I like that concept as well. Thank you, Katarina. Okay, that was last week. Well, let's load you back. A few reminders from last week, from Jari, your lecture. Because last week we really talked about the taking a step back. Having those different kind of lenses or eyeglasses to be able to look at the organization from a different perspective and understanding the kind of the diversity of what an organization actually is. And we have this slide from Jari, where there's the contextuality, what is an organization, the language, the meanings, the relations, the processes, practices, culture, and all of that. Which, can be summarized like this, that there's actually no single truth about the organization. So if we're in this course trying to learn how could we facilitate organizational change, well, let's start with the fact that there's no single definition or single truth what an organization is. So we just have different contexts, and we can use different lenses. And there's many more than one lens that we can use. So in other words, to kind of bring back what we talked already last week, you could pose it as a question like this. What is an organization really? Is it something you can objectively measure from the outside, or is it a social construct, what we talked about last week? Language, is it the departments? Is it the processes, practices, routines, all of that was mentioned last week? And to add to the complexity or the abstract painting, if you will, whose point of view? At what point of time? In what context? Well, those of you with mathematical skills can quickly calculate how many different combinations we can have of the same organization. Let's just say that there are many, so many different combinations that you just can't handle them all. Which kind of brings us back to the facilitator's question is, if we're changing organizations, what are we actually changing? All of those? Everything in that complexity? Of course, this shouldn't, this is the world. If we put people together, it becomes extremely complex. And that's fantastic. That's how living a human life is rich and complex. But as a change agent in an organization, this complexity and richness should definitely not paralyze us. Even though there are so many lenses and so many different perspectives into an organization, we can still be calm about it. We can still be rational about it and analytical about it. Make no mistake, we can still be engineers about it, if you will. But let's not just make the mistake, and let's not have others make the mistake, that we can somehow reduce the whole organization into a couple of static parts and tell that this is the organization. And like it says in the slide, there's a fancy word for this called reductionism, which is kind of a trap, kind of academic word for a trap, where you believe that you can actually reduce things into few static parts and their interactions. Because once we start being calm and rational and analytical about it, we should simplify and reduce. And once we do the simplification, the cutting the corners and making choices, we should be very conscious of what are the lenses we're using. What's our agenda? What's our motivation? Why are we cutting this? Why are we leaving this out? Why are we taking this in? And now you can already hear the echoes from last week's exercise. Because this already was kind of a warm-up. That because you cannot explain the whole organization because it's too complex, you need to cut corners. And just drawing the simple onion is a very good beginning. But remember, do it as a pair exercise. You can start drawing it alone, but once you start doing it together with somebody, it actually becomes a dialogue, and you dig deeper and you surface certain important questions that we mentioned. Good. So today I'm going to go through at least two, let's call them 2.5 kind of perspectives, lenses, whatever. What does an organizational transformation look like? And of course, selecting those lenses, it's always good to be very conscious about whose perspective, what context, and in this point of time as well. And here's just like using the onion again. We can have different kind of lenses that can become very practical. So this is kind of the analytical in us, starting to take the abstract painting and making it into concrete pieces. So we can have an outside perspective, maybe top management perspective. Middle management definitely has a different perspective. Team leader, business owner, grassroots, and so forth and so forth. So that's a very simple way of thinking, that what you already started doing last week. And the first one I'm going to go over is transforming a company kind of from an outside perspective, like an outsider, like an observer. And the kind of culture in my examples or actually one or two I have here, is really what we talked last time. This is kind of a vision of an agile culture, changing an organization to become an agile culture, where the grassroots take responsibility and so forth. This is kind of what I call the anti-Taylor vision last time, which is still a reflex to the Taylorism that was dominating organizations and business management for a century. And this is the kind of the model I'm going to introduce to you to give you an example what an outside view might look like. This is something actually that I did together with colleagues at Bearing Point a few years ago. So together around the table, we were actually half a dozen of management consultants who had done a lot of different kind of transformation programs in large companies. And we kind of sat down and thought that, okay, what typically happens? And we were consultants, so we do a maturity model. And typically in this model, especially here in Finland, when it comes to large companies, things seemed to have worked something like this, that first you have disconnected pioneers, individual people who come from a different company with a different background. Maybe they have read a bunch of books and have a lot of new ideas, and they're enthusiastic. They want to change the way that they're working. They want to change the organization. And they meet each other informally and bump into each other. And gradually these people organize themselves. They're like, hey, there's the 5 of us. We've been talking about this for now half a year. Why don't we start an internal training? Typically it might be like a Scrum Master training or design thinking workshops, or let's just make this formal and invite anybody to have like Fridays culture coffee moments or something like that. And then top management starts noticing this in a good way. They're like, wow, we have these people who are already doing these things that sound very good and promising, and they seem to get interest and traction. Call that pockets of change. And then kind of gradually, when these pockets of change grow from the grassroots, then at some stage, typically the top management is like, yes, we indeed need to change our company culture. We need to make big changes in our organization. And that's what I call kind of big wheel of change. So it gets a top management agenda, maybe gets resources, a budget, maybe there's a person put kind of officially in charge of it and so forth. And then everybody's kind of helping that. Then step 4 would be the new normal. There would be the vision of a new culture. And here's just an example of kind of typical actions that are done in large companies to figure out what should be done and how should these things happen, and do we have those pioneers, do we have those pockets of change, and so forth and so on. And then typical actions for the big wheel of change, governance models and pilot projects, and thinking about scaling it up from individual pilots. As an example, I have one from Yle, YLE, the Finnish public broadcasting company. And this is something I've been watching as an outsider, and I also had a master's thesis work 2 years ago to actually document the change. And I have a link to that thesis later in the slides. So what happened at Yle was that it was actually over 10 years ago, they started developing their streaming services. So they're a public broadcaster, used to have a lot of TV channels and digital media. And once they started building the capability to have the streaming services, they brought in new people. Some of them external consultants, but also, hiring people with software background and digital media background. And these people had different ways of thinking of how work should be done. They had different ideas. And to put it bluntly, many of them were, agile developers, fluent in Scrum and that kind of ways of working. And they got together with other people and they got enthusiastic, and they actually started doing their own internal trainings for product ownership, agile PO trainings. And they become really popular as well. And they had events and get-togethers, and it was kind of spreading from the grassroots. And you actually had kind of emergent new leaders, people who didn't have leader in their business card. But people were like, hey, I've heard about these product owner trainings. Who should I ask? And then it was like, hey, ask that person. That person knows about it. And suddenly those people become the emergent leaders. And then what happened at Yle was there actually was a crisis in the company culture, nothing to do with internal culture as such, but actually the journalistic culture. It was big news way back then. Not going into details of that, but this gave an opportunity for all those people who had been building this agile, lean culture to go to the very top, to the board of directors and say, we actually have a lot of things to say about this new culture. And so eventually they hired a new CEO, and the kind of this new ways of working, new digital culture was taken into account in building the next step for the company. So the big wheel kind of changed. And then actually, interesting thing happened was that they kind of reached the level that the whole company knew what Agile meant for them. They kind of understood. They had a huge amount of trainings. They had a lot of people who had nothing to do with digital as such, take into use different ways of working and a lot of canvases and post-its. And then they found themselves asking that, well, we have now this kind of this agile culture. What are we going to do with it? And then they kind of, as an outsider, it looked like this, that they had built this like amazing speedboat, but they didn't know where to go with it. Well, of course, this conversation, they had answers, was that actually, hey, we have in our strategy that we're building this digital customer experience. So let's use this agile culture to help us build a better digital customer experience. But also the meaningful work, the value for society became another thing, that we can use this culture, these tools and this shared thinking to build a better workplace. So that was a very brief introduction to the story of Yle. See a couple of comments. Change is also dependent on culture. There's so many cross-cultural differences. Absolutely. So this is very cultured. That's why I'm emphasizing kind of that this is a very Nordic way of, the Nordic backbone. And the example of a public broadcasting company in Finland is that the groundwork for culture is very different, because it's, in a way, it is a company, but it's not as such a publicly listed for-profit company. It's a public servant in a way, although it's not owned by government. It is kind of owned by government as well. So in a way, the kind of all of this, and another thing was that it is still a journalistic company. So you have these certain values in it, kind of Nordic values, public sector values, journalistic values that actually fit very nicely with the values of these new agile cultures. So it was actually a very fertile ground. Which brings me to another example of things might not go as planned. Of course, I'm not going to tell what company this is, but again, this is something I've been involved in watching as an external consultant and coach. And in a very similar way, there were disconnected pioneers, new people coming in, thinking about how do we new digital services and how do we make this organization work better in the digital world. And there were organized trainings and people got together, and me and my colleagues were hired as external coaches to help them have these different spearheads and programs and accelerators for new ways of working. And then, just like it says in the slide, there was no big wheel of change. There was a small wheel of change. So a little bit of changes from the top management, a little bit of resources, but for some reason, which actually I don't know in detail, the change didn't happen. It was kind of like, you're trying to start a car and it just goes, but it never started. And so they actually gradually went back to the old normal. And then, let's say, after like 5-6 years, I found myself again as an external coach in this company, doing the same thing over again. Some of the people had left during that 5 years, but some of them were still there. And I'm not saying there was nothing bad about it. Maybe the time just wasn't right. Maybe that big company wasn't ready for the change. And then they kind of started again. New acceleration programs, new trainings, new pilots, and so on. So those are kind of just two examples. And the main point being that, of course, the company culture changes, whether you want it or not, whether there's an official change program or not. Things change. New people come in. People get new ideas. People see examples of doing things differently. And there is always kind of gradual bubbling of change going on. The other main point is that this change is not linear. It's not like it's happening gradually like this, but it most probably happens in jumps. So something is bubbling, and then maybe there's an event that pushes things to the next step. And then you need to push to the next step, and so forth. Yeah, Anna, you're mentioning also that Thomas Kuhn's idea, that's definitely the same thing about scientific revolution. Things that in science, well, actually the same thing, that they don't happen linearly, but you actually have kind of I guess you could say like earthquakes, that there's like this pressure, and then boom, suddenly there's enough pressure for things to change. So a very similar kind of thing when it comes to organizational change. In big corporations, mainly in the Nordics, and like somebody there also commented, the word culture is good here, because that underlines the fact that there are other cultural things that are in the background. The culture of leadership, the culture of organization, culture of hierarchies, and so forth and so on. But one, I have kind of this sidestep now that I think is important for, if we look at who we are here, and I think many people are taking this course are kind of relatively young, if you will. Most of you students are under 30. And suppose many of you other participants are also kind of pretty savvy about agile development and maybe design thinking. And I mean, you're well educated and you know a lot about these things. And this is kind of my experience of being a little bit critical about desiring for change. And this is what I call the old bosses don't get it narrative. Because just like in populism, you have these like big narratives, and once you have a narrative that is very attractive, people kind of jump into it and suddenly you think that this is the truth. So let's go over what I mean by this. And I mean simply this, that we have these red buttons here. These are the new people with new thoughts and going to the boss person, who is the black one over here, saying, oh, we don't need any bosses. We need just flat high companies, no hierarchies, autonomy for the people, and Agile manifesto, and let's read the lean startup, and it tells us that we don't need these all kind of structures. Old men in suits, they're dumb, they don't get it, the digital world is changing, and so forth and so forth. And then, of course, I would say typically the boss of a large organization is like, what are you talking about? And maybe the boss has actually really good questions to those revolutionaries, if you will. So what are you talking about? Are you talking about individual projects? Are you talking about ways of working? Are you talking about our R&D? How does all this fit into all the other stuff that our corporation is doing, especially in the investments we're doing? How are you coordinating among yourselves? I mean, you are 100 people, so how are you organizing yourselves? And one of the favorite examples I've been kind of watching again is that there's been very enthusiastic people about changing, but then the big corporation, 90% of the workforce are not white collar educated people. So the question is that, okay, this new company culture is fantastic, but how does it look like for the 90% of our personnel? And then the last comment is really what we touched a little bit about. We are an international company. So if this might work in Finland, how does it work elsewhere? How does it work in our international offices and so forth? I think they're valid questions. And I'm sure that could be that the revolutionaries don't necessarily have the answers. But if things go bad, then maybe the thinking is like this. I've been kind of witnessing this, that then the people who are passionate about new culture are like, the boss is stupid, the boss doesn't get it. And then the boss person or people are like, I'm listening to all this new thinking, but they have no idea how to run a large international corporation. And there we are. People wanting the change are just kind of, just like in our society, becomes very polarized. Hey, let's kick out the bosses. And then the people running these big, large organizations says, all this talk about new culture, it's just, it's not for us. Let's forget everything. And all the good stuff that is in there kind of just gets thrown away because it's not speaking the leadership's language. What brought us here? Well, I actually blame much of the popular philosophies. I can't blame them 100%. But I think part of the reason is that all this, let's say, lean startup and design thinking and agile development and, well, perhaps the classical lean is not the case here. But many of these that come from the digital and the software world, they have origins in the project level. If you think about them, like a business model canvas, for example, it's really on the level of an individual product or a service or a campaign. And if you think of a large organization, they have many, many products. They have perhaps many services. They have many campaigns. And that's kind of, if you, just like me, I'm really talking about myself here. If I come from the design world and the agile development world, my blind spot is that I have never been in charge of a large international corporation. I would never put myself in charge of an international corporation. I don't have that knowledge. And much of this talk about new cultures and new ways of working has very much that same blind spot. And the fact is that if you take business model canvas, or this is something we're going to be talking next week more, take business model canvas, take design thinking or agile methods or Scrum, they are not originally designed as organization tools. No, they're project level tools to develop products and services. And I think this is a good thing to bear in mind when we go for those new revolutionary digital cultures. Which brings me to the question that, I think I jumped over one slide. That if you could design, well, the examples I gave you, the organizations already existed. They were like existing large organizations and they wanted to change themselves. But for a second, if you had an opportunity to build a new organization from scratch, would you start inside out? Would you start from an individual team and so forth and go bigger and go bigger and go bigger? And of course not. If you could design an organization from scratch, you would go outside in. You would define what's the purpose of the organization, who are the customers, what the market looks like, what's the business domain. So you would start actually with the outer layer of the onion, if you had that luxury. And just as an example, this is a startup former students in our program have made, and I've been watching what they do. And this is literally how they built their company, even before going to the number one layer of the onion. So they definitely did it from scratch. They had the very first fundamental question, the purpose question. Why do we do it? What's the founding vision? There were three people, they got together and decided to found a company. That's the very first question. Why do we want to do this? We could do something else. And once they have kind of the founding vision, if you will, then you get questions like, okay, how are we going to be unique in the market? And if this is our unique value proposition, how should we organize ourselves? This is how we organize ourselves. How do we make decisions? How do we lead? And then how do we split the teams once we grow? And then kind of last but not least, on the individual level, how do we recruit individuals? What kind of expertise, what kind of people we want to bring in so that the whole onion kind of makes sense as an organization. And just stating the obvious in here is that large organizations, transformations, the ones that you typically hear from lectures like you heard today, the ones you read from, business school cases, the ones you hear maybe from public media, they are typically large organizations. And they, of course, happen inside out, because you cannot take a big organization, throw it into the trash bin, and start from scratch. But even if you end up changing a large organization, which most of us probably do unless we start a new one, just keeping in mind that the whole rationale for change, kind of the design driver for the change, should happen outside in. So let's kind of keep these two things separate. Let's see what kind of comments you have there, and I'll let you digest this for a while before the break. Oh, there's too many comments. I can't read because it's jumping. Simon says, I feel it's always dangerous to emulate a specific framework. Not suiting it to your own needs often leads to handless following. Yes, Simon, that's very well put. I think we need frameworks, and those of you who might be familiar with things like, what's the one, the famous Agile framework, SAFe, S-A-F-E, SAFe framework. And I guess at least Simon, your comment just reminded me that typically I hear people saying that people take it as such and then they kind of just plug it into the organization. But frameworks are great, but you should adapt them and you should really understand how does this framework fit our specific culture and how are we going to change things so that it becomes our own. And I guess we're going to touch kind of that on a theoretical level later on this course. Not safe, but the way that we actually need to take things and make them ourselves. Someone is asking, in the startup roadmap, do you think that the onion could be used? I think it could be definitely used in the way I just presented, starting from the outside in. That if this is the big thing, this is the big, typically startups, because of the way that they're trying to gather funding, they need a very clear purpose and a very clear vision of how they fit the market. But that definitely could be used kind of the onion in the same way that you go then inside the onion into the individual person's level and kind of make it clear how does this individual person contribute to the bigger picture. Ari, thank you. Safe is not agile according to the agile purists. I just love it that there are agile purists in this world. Usually startups are about vision first, so they are outside in. Absolutely. Well, that's the point. And if you're thinking about whether you are in a big, medium, large organization, just as a practice, take the onion and draw it the other way around. Draw it from outside in, inside out. Again, draw it with somebody else, so you're having a dialogue. But again, the point of these simple tools is that they're so simple. You can just take a 15-minute coffee break and draw it. And, maybe it helps you to clarify your thoughts. Maybe it gives you a different perspective into what is actually relevant in this context. What's the relevant organization now to get these things done? Excellent. Super thanks for the comments there. But now we're actually having the 5-minute break. And then we look at transforming from top management perspective. Yes, Mieli Halkka, I agree with you. Top executive support is important. We're going to get to that soon. Yle model requires freedom at the factory floor. Yes, I think I saw that. That was good that the Yle had a very specific starting point in the culture. Alexandra saying, interestingly, all the examples start with teams dealing with technology-enabled products or services. Is this always the case? I'm a bit hesitant to say that, yes, it's always the case. But I'm saying that the fact that we are getting the kind of everything becoming digital is causing the fact that people with kind of software ways of working are finding themselves in new different situations, and typically they are the very first change agents. I would say that's probably true. That because software is so predominant as a technology, it's also bringing the software culture with it to different organizations. I think I'm bold enough to say that that's a fact. Okay, let's change lenses. Click, click. Not radically, but let's have another look of what kind of a top management, if that was kind of looking at it from the outside, maybe kind of objectively, a little academically. So what does it look like if you are the CEO, if you are the big boss, or if you're the chief culture officer or digital officer responsible for the change? What does it look like? And you don't have to be, I would say, a big boss of a big corporation to do this, but I think these are valid for any company that is getting large. And again, this is something from my years as a management consultant and working with organizational changes, kind of a roadmap to make all the kind of complexity a little bit more simple of how to build a new company culture. And there's a link to this blog post where you can get that infographic if you want. So again, this was done together with my colleagues at Bearing Point, capturing kind of what are the big things to consider for a C-level leader doing cultural transformations, organizational transformations. So let's use that again as a starting point, as a discussion point to put things together. And like one of you commented there in the chat, it's all about starting. That's the top leadership. Do they want to change? Are they ready for the change themselves? And I have each of these 6 steps. I have like these questions that if you imagine yourself as an employee, a worker in that company, what would be the questions you would ask? And in this case, it would be like, okay, dear boss, or dear board members, you want me to change. Are you, as leaders, ready to change yourself as well? And it consists of things like these. Learning and experiments, are they considered an investment or cost? How easy is it for the leaders to give away decision-making? If they really believe that the grassroots should get responsibility, it means that they should give away decision-making, doesn't it? And the last of these, that how do they personally gonna embrace the change? Because I think in many organizations, people are looking at the big boss. And how does that person, is that person doing things differently? If that person is preaching that we should be happy to make mistakes, is the CEO making mistakes? And is the CEO making those mistakes public so that we can all see that it's actually okay to make mistakes? Very practical things like that. Okay, let's say that the top management seems to be committed. They really want the change. There's a good business case for changing the organization culture. The obvious next step is, so what's the vision? If this is organization now, can you describe our vision of what it should be after the change? And what's our strategy getting there? So to put it as a sparring questions is that, okay, dear boss, you want me to change? Change to what? Can you give me something to aim at? And again, this is kind of like basic strategy school book stuff. There's no magic to it, but somehow, if you look at large companies, it's not clear to everyone how to answer questions such as these. For example, how is the industry changing? How is the market changing? Who is changing it? Who are our customers, and how are our customers changing? What's so unique about our company, our organization? And then the last one about strategy is that the vision, that we cannot change everything. we need to leave something out. Why are we leaving these things out? And let's say that we have the top-level commitment, we have a strategy and a vision, and the third one is that supportive structures, just like in this picture, the scaffolding. And the sparring question, again, is that, okay, dear top level, you want me to change. How will you support that? Are you there to support? Maybe I'm ready for change. How are you going to support me in that change? And it's going into things such as these. So what are the decision-making principles? If you're giving me grassroots more decision-making power, are there certain principle ways of working? How does it work? Then in a kind of more traditional companies, we have very strict ways of reporting and documenting things. Are these going to support the change, or are they going to remain the same? Success. How are we going to measure success of change? Is this going to be connected to our bonuses and KPIs? How does this going to work? Because these are the supporting structures. And once we have those three, then the fourth one is that, okay, are we capable of change? Do we have the know-how, the knowledge, the skills, competencies to be capable to change? So maybe it's questions like this, or actually the sparring questions like this. So do I need to become something new? Do I need to, for example, educate myself, learn new tools, ways of thinking? And capabilities are things like systems, legacy systems. Which ones are we going to overhaul? Which ones we're going to keep as such? What's our recruitment strategy? Are we going to get new people in? How are we going to get them in? There's probably competition for talented digital business people, for example. What about training and education, existing workforce? How are we going to change them? Is there any change there, and so forth? What about all these, big themes like AI, machine learning, platform economy? How do they fit in here? Because whatever change we're doing is probably also related to the business we are doing as well, and the technology and so forth. Step number 5. So quick recap: top-level commitment, vision and strategy, supporting structures, an idea of capabilities and competencies. If we have all those 4 ready, next step, what's the very first step? This picture here about the penguins reminds me, or I put it there because I've learned that in at least in American English, there's a concept of a first penguin. And supposedly penguins are on an ice, on the edge of ice like that, and they should go and eat the fish in the sea, but nobody knows whether it's dangerous or not. But eventually there is one penguin, the first penguin, who dares to jump into the water. Rest of the penguins see that is there a killer whale or somebody else that will eat the first penguin. And if there isn't, the rest will follow. So this picture is to kind of remind that step number 5, who are the first penguins? Who are going to start doing the first steps for the change? And the things to go over is that, do we have teams that have maybe taken new ways of working, new work culture into use? And how do they fit in? Are these the first penguins? And once we have these spearheads or pilot projects, if you will, are we going to give them like really important stuff to work on? Or are we going to give them something less important? Because that's going to communicate to everybody whether there's belief in this new way of working. If we're going to give something super critical to them, then it looks like we're really serious about this. And then typically, at least when you look at large companies in the past decade, what they start doing is they have like innovation hubs or innovation labs where they do new things in a new way. So they kind of have like a petri dish of having a new company culture in a separate organization. That's a classical way of starting new things. And then the last point, that how once you have those first penguins, how are you going to communicate this to the rest of the company? If you have one project team that is given a permission to work very differently, how are you going to tell the rest of the company what's going to happen and why and what are you trying to achieve here and how did they succeed or did not succeed? And then last but not least, let's say that your first penguins are successful. Then the question is that, okay, now we have maybe 30 people who have done things differently for 6 months, but there's still 3,000 people left in the company. So how do you scale up? What are the, if that was step number 1, what are the steps number 2, 3, 4, 5? So in other words, how do you communicate the results so far? How do you communicate the whole change process? How do you gather learnings from those penguins? Okay, penguin ABC actually died because of a killer whale. I'll make a note so we don't jump there anymore, for example. And then, of course, how do you get the very top level support for this if you don't already have it? And then last but not least, what are the success criteria for this change? This is actually something we're going to practice. The exercise, I think, after this week is going to be a little bit about the success criteria. Let's see a couple of comments, and soon we're going to have the first exercise. We're nicely ahead of schedule. Any large change seems to need, this is Sophie, your comment, needs support from many levels of the organization, top for implementing the change and lower levels to actually take new changes into use. Absolutely, well put. If either support is not given, the implementation will face quite a lot of challenges. Yes, so you kind of need all levels. And you can imagine the larger the organization, the more time it just simply takes to communicate to everybody what it means. Because in a large organization, if you're really good at communicating, it means you need to speak everybody's own language. You know, just that's why we drew the onion. That you realize that if you want success in the middle level, you need to understand how does the middle level see the world. If you want success on the grassroots, how do they see the world? And that's what I mean by understanding the language that you're going to communicate, the vision, the strategy, the steps, the support structures. And it's obvious that then the larger the organization, the more time this is going to take. And in our digital world where we are kind of expecting things to happen very fast, we sometimes forget that organizational change might typically takes years. The Yle story, the YLE story I had, I think roughly, like I said, it started over 10 years ago. And in a way, it's ongoing all the time. So it's very difficult to say when it starts and where it ends. But we're measuring things in years when it comes to large organizations. So don't wait for quick wins if you're dealing with large changes in large organizations. Let's see what else. All levels disagree, then it becomes difficult. Yes, we're having a discussion. Thank you, Katarina, for pointing out. Yes, definitely, especially as in successful Agile, all of the parties have some role to play. If any of the levels disagree on taking their role, then the organization or Agile as a whole doesn't work as it should. That's an excellent point. And this is something we're going to come back later in the later lectures, is how, at least the way we see it, that it goes back to, like I talked a little bit about the communication. How do we as facilitators, how we need to understand how people, at the same time listening to people, but again, kind of communicating these things. So those of you who have done anything like what I just described here fully understand that it's actually very much a communication exercise. It's not like you come up with some magical innovation, but it's just talking, listening, and talking. Good. let's have you now talk and listen about these things. So let's have the group work of today. And my question to you in the groups, which Kiara will send you soon, is what do you think is probably difficult in implementing this change? And I put here in the right-hand side, you might want to take a picture of that slide. Here I have the change leader checklist, the 6 steps. And then I also have the questions for the change leader as well for each of those steps. Just to give you a conversation point of which ones of those steps do you think is most difficult, or in your experience, what is the most difficult part in this, or whatever. The point being sharing your experiences and sharing your thoughts and questions. But what do you think that makes this thing difficult? And those of you, if you feel like, oh, I've never been in an organizational change, I'm still a student, you can very easily think of yourself as the person being asked to change, and what kind of questions and feelings actually will pop up. And then again, please put the bullet points into the chat, the summarization of your team. Now we have definitely a few minutes to hear your thoughts, or if you have any questions. So I'll try to see if somebody raises their hand. And meanwhile, please do write your summarizations into the chat, because we save them and we go through them afterwards. Katerina, you have your hand up. Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I would like just to talk shortly what we talked about as a team with Felix and others. So we talked about kind of a change, this top level towards the employees. That's very often that it's very hard, to change the whole organization. It takes time when it goes like from the bottom towards like down, and when it's going like from the down to the top, it's more easier. And especially like right now in crisis, when like we learned obviously a lot from the COVID pandemic about the change, right? And now it's kind of the next trigger, this war that we are experiencing now in Ukraine, and we can see how many organizations are willing also to change their strategy. We're thinking about their future, about tomorrow, what will happen, with whom I will collaborate, will I collaborate with Russia or not? Like it's about navigating through uncertainty and navigating through the change. And we also talked about like change in big organizations, like for example Volkswagen. I was at that time, and when always a crisis happens, I'm kind of a part of it. So I have been during the Volkswagen crisis. I've been also we all have been during the COVID crisis, and now it's kind of also the war crisis, also part of crisis that touched me personally in Ukraine. And I think like there's a lot of things to learn of it. And right now, especially, it's good to discuss also how we kind of, if one organization, one community is bringing some change, and like it's driving forward and new forms of organizing ways, and trying to challenge those big organizations to adapt, like to provide new services for the refugees, to learn from the previous crises that we had with Syria and like others. So, and like the question is how we scale up this organizing for change. And that was a question I would love really to hear your response, Risto, to this scaling of change in terms of time and agility. So do you know concrete examples of scaling change across organizations, across countries, and maybe especially in extreme contexts? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think you made a lot of good points. Before actually quickly answering your question, I think you made a great point. We just talked a little bit with Jari here, waiting for you from the breakout rooms. And the point is that we have, I think that's the difference between kind of traditional change management and a crisis management. When you go to a crisis such as we've had the pandemic or the war in Ukraine, there isn't necessarily a vision of where we are going. in a more kind of traditional and how should I say, stable situation, we could say that this is the examples I've been using today. This is the kind of culture we're trying to build. But the difference in a crisis, at least in my perspective, is that we don't really know. We cannot set a goal as such. We can definitely set goals, but we cannot have a clear vision because we're so uncertain about the future. And that's, I think, is a different kind of change management and leadership. It probably has a lot of similarities with what we're talking in this course. But it's kind of like running into the fog without definitely having no idea what's, is there a road at least there? Mm. So I think that's kind of basically the difference between crisis management and the kind of traditional change management. Jari, do you want to add something?
Yes, in the situation of crisis, that what can ease the change is that we turn in a kind of survival mode, that there is a really clear sense of urgency that we have to do, and that time it's maybe easier to adapt, and people accept easier the measures we have to take. But of course, then how to deal with the uncertainty and also all the emotions that raise in crisis situation, because people it can turn very existential, and they can be very fundamental fears and worries there as well. So the communication is needed all the time, and of course then in crisis it's easy also to adopt more this kind of authoritative leadership, and maybe it's also expected sometimes. But then what happens after this first shock, and then how we continue, and so I think it's always the situation where we can't step outside to control change outside. We are partakers, and we have to live that with people and communicate constantly, create kind of communicative let's say processes and structures where people can also share things and also their emotions and their worries, and then of course to channel the emotional energy towards the actions. It's also needed, but it's something that when we are in uncertainty, it's and change, what we talk about, it's more taking change as such that we really can't control it. When we ignite some change, then it starts to take its own course in a way, and we can channel, we can take advantage on certain opportunities, but then there will be surprises always, and we have to always be prepared for those. But then there can be also kind of positive surprises, that something proceeds quicker, and how to utilize those opportunities to scale up and in a way make that moment kind of example or stronger. And so it's quite a living thing in a way. And of course, as a facilitators or ambassadors, whatever we are also experiencing uncertainties, and that's something we have to encounter as well. And again, how we can talk about that, how we can get support for ourselves, and so all those are important kind of principles.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jari and Risto.
Yeah, I think and then actually, Katarina, to answer your question quickly, I'll have in the end the Wiley story. I think that's a success story, and there's the whole master's thesis which actually documents it. So that's a quick answer of how you can. I'll get back to that later in the lectures of how to do successful.
Share it about this Jari case.
Yeah, and then, but I want to point out, Anna Junnila, you have a really good comment here as well about what we talked about crisis, and what Jari, you just talked about, that when we cannot set the goals, the kind of the leadership also needs to kind of emphasize different things. And you mentioned the emotional leadership and the support, that no, we don't know what's going to happen. So, and as a leader or as a facilitator, at least it kind of goes to basic human things, is that at least you can do is listen, at least you can communicate what we know and tell that what we're going to do next. Kind of thing. Then obviously we humans become more kind of emotionally, how should I say, sensitive when the kind of the rationality, the goal setting and the analytics kind of goes away.
And so I would like to emphasize the emotional side, because in change it's always about emotions first, and then if we bypass that too quickly, then people can feel that they are not heard, and so on. And in crisis it's even more important. But then of course not starting to circulate in this emotional soup, in a way, but then of course try to channel the energy towards actions. It's important, and that's part of the change leadership from my perspective, very very crucially.
And then obviously here maybe you want to already start in your mind thinking about difference between leadership and facilitation, and this is something we're going to talk about. I think Jari, you're going to talk about kind of the role of facilitation, because typically when we talk about leadership, it assumes that the person has responsibility over others in a different way than a facilitator. Sometimes we will think that facilitator is kind of like, I'm just helping you to get there, but actually you have the responsibility to get there. But hey, super good comments here. Picking a couple from the chats. I think here you have Daniel has a really good comment about there's a lot of inertia in status quo situations and communicating the reason for change. What else did we have? We had Elsa, you had really good bullet points about the leader asking for change and the person asking to be changed. And then let's see, Verena, what I have experienced is that due to really long changes, changing top management, which was something totally different and isn't longer committed. Yeah, I think that at least to me resonates with the fact that, like I said, that these changes can take years. I'm not talking about crises as such. And we just lose interest. I think the pandemic, we have all been there now, is that just recall how different the pandemic was at different stages, how it was in the very beginning, what it was all about, our attitude towards change. And then somehow we got maybe bored about it and we lost interest in it. And then there was new, So these are living organisms, the change in itself, not just the organization. But let's continue. Kind of typical roadblocks, especially in a corporate world or large organizations. If we don't want to be only in the commercial context, you can always think about university here as a large corporation that is not as such commercial. Kind of school book examples of what is stopping change. And my favorite is governance. The thing that how does the large organization govern itself? Some of it is legal, of course, kind of like the picture of the police over here. So you need to do things, you need to govern that people don't break the law, but it includes so much more. How do people manage things? How does reporting go and so forth? What kind of valuation models? So if you're working in an innovation or new business design, how are your ideas valued? How are the calculations made, like cash flow calculations? And all of those things. Those are like the scaffoldings that actually, if you don't change them, you can just dream about different ways of working. The other kind of school book example is budgeting, of course. You can ask for people to do things differently, but if you give, if the budgeting cycle is once a year, and let's say that now in April, we're going to give money for the next year, how can you change things after that? I mean, that's easily realized that how the budgeting actually sets the clock speed for change and sets the possibilities to change things fast because, things require resources. And how are those resources allocated and how fast can you reallocate? And then a very simple thing again that we all know is that change requires a lot of talking, a lot of discussions, listening to other people, our colleagues, talking up, talking down, talking sideways. Is that considered proper work? It's kind of the classical questions. Where should I put these hours? I just had a fantastic conversation with my colleague. Where do I put the hours? And we all know and we all appreciate those unproductive encounters, meeting somebody from a different department and realizing that, hey, we're facing the same problem. Might be the most valuable thing for many months, but it's not necessarily valued, making those encounters happen is not valued in the way that the company culture works. And then the last example is that you can ask people to change, and you can try to convince them that this is actually a good way to change. But if you don't change the career models, if your organization has like just these 3 career models, and those career models don't support change, then what can you do? You can ask people to change, but if you're not giving them any new paths to grow, then nothing's going to happen. It's going to stop right there. And again, we kind of have the scaffolding there to remind me. It's just, if I was to make large organizational change, I would definitely put so much attention into the scaffolding, into the kind of invisible structures of how that organization works, and change from there. Because, for example, it's as obvious as that if you change people's career path models and KPIs and bonuses, then things are going to change. I can guarantee that. But the main point in all of this, and remember we were still thinking about the top management perspective, and kind of it echoes to the dinosaur little narrative I had, that from the very top perspective, if you talk about cultural transformation, it's a holistic thing. It includes so many things. And I think we should keep that in mind, because I think there are very few of us have such a good holistic picture of how organizations work. We have our own lenses. And again, it kind of goes just to be mindful that we're probably missing something. That, maybe you're an expert on innovation, but, you don't really understand governance models and all of themselves. Or maybe you just forget that, hey, I need to change myself. This actually requires for me to do things differently. Good. Which brings me to the second exercise. Let's see. A couple of comments here. One last comment. Professionals experience top-down change is always easier and more effective. The change needs to be smooth and effective, because if it's not, all the resources allocated to the transformation will be wasted. That's why it's necessary to have top management involved in the transformation. Absolutely well put. Another perspective suggested, there is continuous change in an organization. What if instead of resource-intense transformations, organization structure would have built in the features that take advantage change within the organization? So I guess you're kind of meaning just kind of going with the flow in a way. If there's already change happening somewhere here and there, you kind of just facilitate that change into certain directions, rather than kind of starting a big change program from top down. Have the people creating the organization actively shape it to fit their own work? Absolutely, that's well put. Daniel asking, what about running into change fatigue? Yeah, that's something I mentioned. And like I said, we all experienced change fatigue during the pandemic on a personal level as well. So many changes have happened that people can't keep up with those. Yes. And again, it's to me, as a kind of a people with a lot of, as a person with a lot of design education, it's always kind of thinking about this as well. So, do I understand my customers? In this case, how well am I listening and understanding the people I want to change? Am I listening to them? Can I get like surveys? What kind of data? When do I spot the fatigue? Am I communicating the change? All of these things we may discuss today, again, kind of starts with that can we spot the fatigue? And when that happens, can we understand the reason where it comes from and what are people getting tired about? Okay. Exercise number 2, dun, da, da, da. It's the temporal onion. So we're going to have onion again, onion soup again, but this time we're going to put it into a time dimension, and deadline before noon next Wednesday. And here's the exercise. So we're going to be drawing kind of similar onion, but we're going to just simply, again, take the work you're doing, but we're going to look at it in a time scale. Before the work and then after. Let me show you what I mean. So last week we drew the onion, and the point was kind of one of the points was that your success of your work is always defined in the next layer of the onion. So it's kind of the success of your work, the impact of your work, is actually happens outside your very own sphere of influence. And oops, there we go. The thing about the context onion last week was great, but it is static. So it's like it's not implying change. The more you talk about it, you might figure out that there's probably a change agenda going on. So let's start drawing it in a timeline. And in simplicity, this is what we're aiming at. Again, your project, that's the small thing in the onion. But the kind of the rationale for your project comes from somewhere, and typically it's outside your own sphere. And when you have done your project, your work, it probably has impact somewhere outside your sphere. Again. So the point is that your project, your work, the thing you're doing, never happens in a vacuum. It comes from somewhere. Somebody has somewhere made a decision that this project should start. And that decision has been made before the project. And once your project is done, it will have an impact somewhere. And that impact will happen most probably outside your project scope. So in a way, we can again think that the success is defined after your work is done. Somewhere there. So let's work with this idea. So how do we plan our project, big, medium, small, whatever size project we have, into the larger context? So when the project starts, there's a beginning, there's a certain context, and then we start doing stuff. And then the project is over, we run out of money, we run out of time, whatever, reached our goals, and then it's the end of the project. In a way, you can say that this is a bit selfish now, isn't it? This is very kind of small mind thinking, because it's not really considering everybody else that is involved outside the project. So what if you draw it like this? That you just draw a longer timeline, a timeline that is much longer than your project. And now pay attention, this is what we're asking you to do. Start the first question is that, let's say, maybe, Jari, maybe you're my pair in this exercise would be that, okay, Jari, once your project is done, take 1 year after the project finished. And what do you think is the impact? What is the impact after 1 year after the project was done? And then talk about it. And then go backwards. What about 6 months? If this is the 1 year impact, so what has happened after 6 months after the end of project? What's the desired impact 6 months after the project? And then go, what about after 1 month? And then you get kind of a different view of when the project ends, what do we need to have so that we actually reach the 1 month impact, and then the 6 month impact, and then the actual desired impact that might be 1 year, 2 years, whatever. And the same the other way around. Where do we come from? What's our history? What is already existing? So understanding what needs to be ready before we start. What do we need to understand about existing stuff and context and stakeholders and whatnot before the beginning of the project? And now you can plan the project, especially if you're doing a new project that you haven't started. This works, for example, in a simple thing, like you're supposed to run a workshop, just an individual 1-day workshop at your workplace. You could very easily put it into this framework and start a good conversation. What needs to be ready before the workshop starts? And when the workshop ends, what needs to be done so that you reach the 1 month, 6 months, and 1 year? And this, again, the secret of this exercise is to help you formalize and talk about and clarify the change you're aiming at. Again, maybe this sounds a bit childish, maybe this sounds a bit obvious, maybe this is not academic for you. But again, a reminder, and maybe we're going to say this at every lecture. It's not the tools are silly. In a way, a child could use the tool. But that's the power, because it's not the tool. The tool is not the magic spell. If you just do everything and don't think about it, if you just do the tool and not have a conversation with another person, you're missing the whole point. But now, just like last year, but now you're maybe more aware, start paying attention to the process that happens when you take the tool into use. What is hard? If you're doing it for the other person, can you spot what is actually difficult for that person to explain to you? Because that's interesting. What seems to be really complex? What seems to be unclear? Because those are the things you want to figure out as a facilitator. Because then you can go back and say, hey, by the way, Jari, it sounded to me that was really difficult for you to explain. Do you feel the same? Or why do you think it seems so difficult, and so forth? And that is driving you towards the root causes, the bigger problems, the great maybe insights that you're going to have using the tool. So here's the slide for your work. Again, don't draw your own project, draw the other person's project, and then reflect on it and write down those reflections for us as well. Because once you write them down for us, you write them down for yourself as well. And ta-da, you do the learning. And before noon next Wednesday. That's it. Lecture 2, but don't leave yet. Again, a list of further readings, academic articles, actually the one blog post where you can get the infograph as well. And then the master's thesis I promised to you. And the one with the Wiley story is the second over here. I could check for next week again, has there been any, and Jari as well, that any new master's thesis. And these are especially for you students there who think like, this is an interesting thing. I wonder if there are any master's theses on this. So that's why we have these here. Here's your checklist. Need to push there. If you haven't done the attendance form, do it by now. Everything's going to be in Medium, I guess tomorrow the latest. And then you're going to get your pairs. And wait for the email. You get your pair. Contact your pair. If nothing happens for a day and a half, that somehow the other person disappears. Then there's, as an emergency option, there is a Slack channel that then you can try to find, hey, I don't have a pair. And then other people, it's a matchmaking thing. But please wait for a few days. There might be a good reason the other person hasn't emailed you back. And please try to avoid student-student pairs, because the point of this course is that professionals and students mix up.
And can I say something here?
Oh, absolutely.
It really, maybe I'm a so old generation guy, but I'm really puzzled with this no response messages, because you are all in this course. Please, if you can't do just send a message that, sorry, I have to skip this exercise, so please, because it's just non-answering. Maybe there's good reasons for that, but it's not really a good responsible behavior. Sorry to say this, but let's try to respond to each other.
Yeah,
it makes things easier. Thank you.
And hey, we're going to stick around for a few minutes, but before everybody goes, happy VAP.
Yeah.
It's going to be, the sun is going to be shining, but it's going to be very cold, I've been promised.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it for today.
Okay.
I'll hang around for a few minutes, but I need to go soon inside. There was something going on there. But thank you. Again,
and I have to
yeah.
give confidence that it was great things to in chat. So please, that's great that you being active, because this is much more active than last year. So I really enjoyed. So please continue that. It was great to see.
Excellent point, yeah.